Okay, this is the second JCrimiTalk, and we are looking at an article that was in the Chronicle Life, and the headline was HMP Northumberland tops North East drug smuggling table. And basically, in short, it was just discussing how visitors of the prison for prisoners have been smuggling in drugs and contraband into the prison, which we spoke about smuggling last time. I tried to keep it on smuggling, but yeah. So what did you think of the article?
I was interested in the focus of the article, because obviously the focus was on drug smuggling, and at the end they just kind of threw in casually that, oh yeah, and it's also got incredibly high levels of self-harm amongst prisoners, yeah. So I thought that was a really interesting focus.
I picked up on it for the whole aspect of like the prison being in crisis, and we'll get to that a bit later. But there was a few other things that I read in the article that, just like what you said, that made me think, wow, the prison itself must be in a problem, why situations like this can happen so freely. What did you think?
I'm not surprised it's happening. A lot of prisoners are going in because they are on drugs, and they're going to go through detox without any sort of support, medical support. And if your child or husband is going through that, and they're going through all that agony, I can see why they're trying to do that. It's not the best thing. And I do think, like, even with airports and things, they can only catch so many.
Yeah, it's true. Because it only says here 8 people were arrested between 2014 and 2015, as opposed to the other prisons, which I've got it written down here. There was like 6, does it say? Yeah, about 6 people were arrested in other prisons, so that extra 2 makes this prison clearly worse off than others.
Or better at catching people.
Better at catching people. I don't think.
I mean, I think that's unlikely, but
yeah, I think there's a lot of people that have gone unnoticed.
Is it realistic? You can search every single visitor.
It's true.
Sniffer dogs are trained to pick out certain drugs, but if you've got legal eyes, are they going to find all those?
It's true. I don't think they will. Also, one thing that I picked up on was the fact that this prison is run by Sodexo, which is a private company, and I have my personal opinions on private companies owning prisons. I don't agree with it personally, but they've controlled Northumberland since 2011. What do you think about that? Do you think that that's part of the reason that the problem can occur?
I think these kind of things are the kind of things that sort of go with efficiency savings, and when you've got private sector involvement, you're always going to have efficiency is always going to be their primary concern, not necessarily the safety of either the public or the inmates. And I think things like higher incidence of self-harm and the ability to smuggle drugs in are the kind of things that are going to go, because you're going to get staff who are either you're either going to get understaffing, or you're going to get staff who are extremely overworked, and they are going to miss things.
Yeah.
So I think that there's definitely going to be a correlation between privatisation and lower level incidents like this.
Just linking back to what you said about understaffing and things like that, it made me think about, like, you know, the orthodox accounts of criminology that delve into factors that you can consider as, you can consider where you know that a prison will be in a crisis. So like the understaffing, the staff unrest, obviously that's going to come with the privatisation of the prison, thus causing self-harm. Not causing, but catalysing, I think is the best term to use.
Haven't they got a 20-year contract?
Oh God, yeah.
So there's the accountability is so minimal. It's not as if every 3 or 5 years they've got to show what they've done. It's every 20 years. So
all they've got to do is pull it out of the bag within the last 2 years, and politicians, because their own terms are so short, have such short memories, they'll get the contract again. Or at least I would imagine that's their thinking. Not necessarily saying that would happen, but I think that would be their thinking.
Because to them it's like, it's not what happens in the 20 years, it's what happens in the the last few or the early few. Also though, I went back on Google last night, and another article popped up about this prison, and someone was found dead. I didn't actually read the article properly, but someone was found dead in the prison, and I assume it was down to negligence. I shouldn't assume, but
well, it's never a good sign, is it?
Yeah, exactly.
I
just started to think, what kind of prison is this?
I think a higher demand for drugs as well. And okay, it might not. Obviously, I'm making an assumption that there's a higher demand, but certainly there's a high level of people who are willing to risk smuggling drugs in, which would suggest a higher demand. I think that's a sign of a badly run prison. Because why do people take drugs in prison? Well, it's escapism, and that suggests that people aren't being properly stimulated, which obviously has bad connotations for recidivism as well once they leave. Perhaps also suggests that people's mental health problems aren't being properly identified. A lot of people self-medicate, especially with cannabis for and heroin at high levels as well for depressive type illnesses and psychotic type illnesses. So it's a really bad sign all round.
Yeah, I mean, there's a high incidence of mental health disorders and personality disorders in prisons, and unfortunately, the worse these are, the more likely they are going to be self-medicating. And if they come into prison self-medicating, they're going to want to continue that. And there's always somebody on the outside willing to make a bit of a cut and make it happen.
And I don't think that these, to say that there's higher levels than there absolutely are, but I think it's only something like about 25% are even identified, and then of that I think it's something ridiculous, like 13% of identified cases are taken on, in prison as a whole, not in this particular prison, are taken on to caseloads by mental health services within there, and then something like 25% of that 13% receive follow-up appointments when they leave prison, so it's no wonder that people are reoffending so often.
It's ridiculous if you ask me. They should put me in charge of this prison. Also, I noticed, I read and I noticed, I checked the statistics. There are 1,342 prisoners in HMP Northumberland, which is basically almost overpopulated. Whereas Britain's biggest prison in Wandsworth holds 1,877 prisoners, and it's built to hold that many. It's meant to have a capacity that big, whereas with Northumberland, they're clearly ramming sardines in a can in there. So I think that's another issue that has to be looked at in regards to seeing that the prison's in a problem. Because I haven't seen one good thing. When I was looking up, I didn't see one good thing about the prison.
It's all about efficiency with the private sector. And in some areas, okay, I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, but I understand that a lot of people believe that efficiency in privatised, formerly public services is important. But is the primary thing. But I don't think that with prison, where you're dealing with people's mental health problems, their physical safety, and long-term the physical safety of the general public, I don't think that getting value for money, as it were, and value for time is the most important thing. You have to take your time over things.
I agree with that, but from a business perspective, how Sodexo are going to probably look at it is that's what they want. They want to cut costs, put as many people in, and try and make it better for them. And I think that's where the issue stems from, because obviously the whole idea of the article where the visitors are smuggling drugs in, for them, 8 people were arrested, but so what, it's 8 people, they're still getting their money, they're still getting their revenue.
It's a potential new prisoners.
It is, yeah. So it's business, and I think that's where the line is, the fine line, business or,
Should we be deciding that there are simply some services that should not be businesses?
I would totally agree.
People are holding on to the NHS and wanting to keep that as a public service. Well, prisoners and everything that goes on with them affects the general public as much as health. So why shouldn't we be keeping that as public service?
And there's an enormous crossover. So we've just been talking about mental health problems. There's a huge crossover with the NHS. I totally agree. I think the philosophy of a good business, people who have good business acumen, their philosophy, there's a time and a place for it, and there's a time and a place for the philosophy of trying to rehabilitate people, or even just contain people, even if you've got lifers, even just try and contain people that in a humane way that they can improve their lives and their outlook. And I just don't think the two things are compatible at all.
No,
you have to be quite ruthless to be good in business, and I just don't think there's a place for it here.
I definitely don't think it should be private, but then looking at the general public, how they perceive prisoners and criminals to be, they'll probably think, well, it doesn't matter as long as they're banged up, and I think that's another issue that I have with having prisoners and criminals in private prisons, because the perception of society's perception on criminals is, they've done bad, they have to get bad, and I don't agree criminals have to get bad. I do agree that they have to I do agree that they have to, what's the word?
Atone?
Yeah, get punished for what they're doing and understand what they've done. But I don't agree that putting them in a private prison and just locking them up, throwing away the key, taking away their humanity is the best decision for them.
Well, you end up with somebody a lot worse than when they went in. And I think deprivation of liberty is enough of a punishment.
Absolutely.
When you really sit and think about somebody being deprived, then they shouldn't have a certain amount of luxuries, but they should be treated like humans to a certain degree, and they should be encouraged to change their ways of thinking in order for them to become a better person to be in society than the person they went in. And if you treat them like animals, they are going to come out worse.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately.
In thinking that, I just thought back to our visit when we went to HMP Grendon. The attitude of the prisoners that were there, as opposed to prisoners I've seen in other prisons like Oakwood, the fact that they've been able to sit and reflect on, what they've done and understand other people's crimes and stuff like that. And it's a state prison, isn't it? Yeah, state prison. Yeah. And I think looking at that compared to, like I said, Oakwood, which is a private prison run by G4S, it's completely different. It's so manic in there and it's so calming.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up Grandin as well, because one of the key conditions that you have on going into Grandin that you agree is, obviously technically you're not supposed to be able to do this anyway, but you agree as an individual, is that you can't take drugs and you can't drink. You also agree that you can't engage in a sexual relationship during therapy. But that's one of the key. So what people are obviously that would suggest that these people are not in receipt of any kind of therapy. And also the kind of conditions at Grandin that make people so much less likely to reoffend is the exact opposite of the conditions which are in place in other areas of the prison service, which would suggest that it makes them much more likely to reoffend.
Yeah.
So. And I've been in a group therapy with drug and alcohol rehab, and it's one of the most powerful things I've ever sat in, where they are confronted by their peers on the issues that they have.
Is it the same kind of structure as what they'd have in?
Except you have 9 people as opposed to 40 in Grendon. You have 40 people in your group therapy, which I can just imagine is quite horrific in Grendon. It's not an easy ride at all, but you actually have to lay your feelings bare and just have them ripped apart and then put back together again by the group of people, and that's not easy in a proper therapeutic environment. But it does work, but it's tough. But
this kind of philosophy is so at odds, isn't it, with the general prison system, because the very autocratic top-down idea in the general prison system is totally at odds with this brilliant system that they have at Grendon, whereby everybody is entitled to a voice. The reason why group therapy works, obviously, is because everybody's allowed to air their views. Everybody has a right to have an opinion on what you've done, and you have to respect their opinion, and they have to respect your right to a rebuttal as well. Totally at odds with how the general prison system treats prisoners. I mean, we'll have to see with the new philosophy that Gove's claiming that he's bringing in. Perhaps things will improve. He's not got a fantastic track record with education, but perhaps things will improve, and perhaps he'll be able to bring in some changes. What you're doing is trying to address people's patterns of thinking that are making them become criminals in the first place. If you're not bothering to do anything about that, they're in prison while you've got a captured audience, what's the point in them being there? You're just basically torturing them, and you're just creating a creature which is going to be more angry, frustrated, aggressive when they leave. You can't program people, you can't tell people, you will now believe this, you will now believe X, Y and Z. They have to be part of their own development. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that the general prison system is missing, is the participatory and the respectful aspect that you get in Grendon is just missing from so many other prisons, and I think that's one of the reasons why people turn to escapism.
I could see it probably being incorporated into state prisons, but I couldn't see private prisons.
Well, there are some private therapeutic communities, but how good they are compared to Grendon.
It's not. It's Dovegate. Private.
Yeah, Dovegate, but it's not. Well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Grendon's a little bit more expensive than the average price for a prisoner every year. However, when you work out the cost of the courts, how the cost on society, etc., if you weigh it out like that, it starts to become cheaper in the long run. But politicians don't look at it that way. They look over 5 years, don't they?
Yeah.
And if they're going to be in power, well, why do they bother?
I mean, I think you also should judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. And yeah, and obviously prisoners, by nature of being deprived of their liberty, are vulnerable. Disproportionately, they were vulnerable before they offended. You know, they come from socioeconomic deprivation. Often, they've had abusive backgrounds, etc. And I think that there's also an argument to say that the way that Grendon treats prisoners is also fundamentally right. Yeah. Apart from looking at money, monetary savings and the safety of the general population, it's actually an ethical way to treat prisoners, and what it says about our society is more positive than what some of the other prisoners in the general population says about our society, especially the privatised ones.
What I got from Grendon, it was a lot tougher for prisoners to actually be in there than in the general population. They are constantly under therapy, constantly scrutinised, constantly called to account for what they've done. And I can imagine that's really, really tough. Whereas I think most people who didn't know about Grendon, who haven't visited it, won't have realised quite how hard it is for them. They're not just banged up and left alone.
Yeah, but Grendon actually challenges your worldview, because prison in general terms, especially for persistent and career offenders, it kind of acts as like an echo chamber for everything you've ever been told. You know, if the harder you are, the further up the tree you are. Sex offenders are scum, but we're not sex offenders, so we're completely and utterly different. Nobody grasses. The screws will treat you like dirt because the establishment's always screwing you over, and it just reinforces over and over again those same kind of code of conduct that led people to offend in the first place. And the uncomfortable fact is that when prison officers treat prisoners badly, and when prisoners don't get the investment for their food and their health care, including mental health care, that they deserve as human beings, there's kind of a grain of truth in their code of conduct, and that's really uncomfortable. That actually, yes, society is doing them wrong. No matter what wrongs they've done, they're still entitled to a basic level of human dignity. And when we give them that grain of truth, it just reinforces that negative code of conduct that they've followed over and over again. They're going to go out into the community, and more innocent people are going to be victims. So it doesn't make any sense to continue with it.
I agree.
What I was struck by was that prison officer saying you can tell the prisoners that have been in Grendon, who've come back into the normal prison population, they don't get involved in the fights, the squabbles, that are taking place. They can actually see the ones that are just sitting back and reflecting on things rather than actually taking part. And I think that could only do good on any prison wing. You've got somebody there with that experience. They might have another 5-10 years in their sentence, but they've been to Grendon, and hopefully they could have an influence on others who might want to go.
Because those are the guys that quite often they would naturally be at the top of the prison hierarchy. They're your armed robbers or cat burglars or whatever. People who've committed sort of the truck crimes that have social capital within prison, and they're like, no, I'm not getting involved in this.
Could you imagine if over time there's more people that have attended Grendon and gone back into regular prison? Could you imagine the change in dimensions within the regular prison? I think it would make...
It would, but isn't that terrible that we've got one prison that's basically supposed to fix the rest of the service? I mean, it's ludicrous, really.
And there's no real waiting list for the sex offenders unit. There is, but I mean, the sex offenders are distributed amongst the rest of the population depending on how bad they are. But there's no real waiting list for this amazing prison.
It's because I think it's how it's sold within general prisons. Like they said, some prisoners assume that those that go into Grendon are, grasses and they're soft and things like that. It's not until they actually get in that they realise the potential of what they...
And they think it's full of sex offenders. Well, no, it's not full of sex offenders. No. It's got some like the rest of the prison population.
It's full of guys who've had to do a lot of work on their revulsion towards sex offenders as much as it is full of sex offenders. And that's got to be a hard thing to do as well, to unlearn, because I think a lot of the general population have that natural revulsion. But I think one of the things that's really, in terms of ways that the government has tried to, or historic governments have tried to address the problem of drugs in prisons, one of the things that's really done more harm than good was the mandatory testing for cannabis, because that stopped people from taking cannabis, because it stays in your system for I'm not sure how long it is. I think it's a couple of weeks or something ludicrous. It's detectable in your system. Heroin's only detectable for 24 hours, so people turn to heroin. And then obviously people then literally die on the streets afterwards from an overdose because they've gone into prison, never taken heroin before, become hooked on prison heroin. go out, they take exactly the same amount and they die, because actually prison heroin is so watered down and it's polluted with God knows what. It's terrible for you, but then when you're exposed to the purity on the outside, that can be just as bad for you because you end up overdosing. So it's just I think that's an example of where the government's tried to intervene, and instead of looking at the cause of the issue, they've just thought we'll deal directly with the symptom, we won't bother to look at the cause. And I think that's what government's been guilty of in the prison sector time and time again. And if they could get over that, and they could actually try and look at the cause of both criminal behaviour and the cause of, you know, prisoners behaving poorly, whether it's drug use or writing or whatever it is within prisons, maybe we'd all be better off.
Fingers crossed, that would be better. Anything else to add? We're going to close up now.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's the end of it, and yeah, finished. Thank you.